101 missiles in the air. That is the kind of number that is supposed to change history. That is the kind of number that is supposed to send sailors running, commanders panicking, and the world bracing for disaster. But when the smoke cleared, the USS Abraham Lincoln was still there, still afloat, still launching aircraft, still doing what American supercarriers were built to do. And that is exactly why this story is bigger than one missile barrage, bigger than one battle, and bigger than one headline. Because the real story of the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Iran War of 2026 did not begin with missiles. It began long before that. It began in 2025 when Abraham Lincoln moved through Northern Edge as more than just a ship. It looked like a floating command hub, a steel brain in the North Pacific, operating as the heart of a much larger combat system. Then came Guam in December of 2025, then the long move west, then the Middle East. By January of 2026, Lincoln was already entering the CENTCOM theater, and by February 7th, CENTCOM confirmed that the carrier was in the Arabian Sea with escorts and more than 60 fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft. That matters, because it means Abraham Lincoln did not appear in the Iran War as a surprise guest. It arrived as a force that had already been prepared, already positioned, and already wired into a much larger campaign. Then the war escalated. Operation Epic Fury, according to official framing in your source material, began at 1:15 in the morning on February 28, 2026. By March 18th, the operation was described as having struck more than 7,800 targets, flown more than 8,000 combat sorties, and damaged or destroyed more than 120 Iranian vessels. That is not the footprint of a symbolic deployment. That is the footprint of an industrial-scale air and naval campaign. And right in the middle of it was Abraham Lincoln, repeatedly described as conducting flight operations in support of Operation Epic Fury. So no, Lincoln was not just present, Lincoln was working. And this is where the ship becomes terrifying. Because a carrier like Abraham Lincoln is not just a ship, it is not even just a warship, it is a runway that moves, a mobile airbase, a floating logistics node, a command platform, a launch point for pressure that does not need anyone else's permission to operate. It does not need a friendly country to hand over an airfield. It does not need to wait for political clearance to use somebody else's concrete. It brings its own air power, its own fuel, its own people, its own defenses, and its own tempo. That is why it is feared. And the fear is not abstract. In early February of 2026, before the wider campaign had even fully matured, an F-35C operating from Abraham Lincoln reportedly shot down an Iranian Shahed 139 drone as it approached the ship. That one moment captured the essence of the carrier in modern war. This was not a passive target waiting to be defended. This was a war machine already watching, already reacting, already hitting back. Then came the bigger narrative, the one that grabbed headlines, the one that spread because it sounded almost too dramatic to believe. The claim that Iran launched 101 missiles at the Abraham Lincoln and the carrier emerged untouched. Whether people focused on the sheer number, the symbolism, or the propaganda war around it, the viral power of that moment is obvious. 101 missiles makes for a headline, it makes for a thumbnail, it makes for outrage, disbelief, and fascination all at once. But the smarter way to tell this story is not to reduce everything to one spectacular night. The smarter way is to explain why the ship could survive, keep operating, and remain relevant even in the middle of a high-end missile environment. And the answer is simple. Layered power. Abraham Lincoln is the 5th Nimitz-class nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. Its home port is San Diego. In the framing you provided, the class is described at roughly 97,000 tons, 1,092 feet long, 252 feet wide, and capable of around 30 knots. The ship herself is run by roughly 2,800 sailors, and the full number rises to around 5,000 when you include the air wing and embarked staff. That already sounds massive. But the scale becomes even more insane when you realize what that steel hull actually supports. 2 nuclear reactors, 4 catapults, 4 arresting wires, roughly 18,000 meals a day, more than 400,000 gallons of fresh water in 24 hours. That is not just a warship, that is a city built for combat, a city built not only to survive war, but to generate war. And what that city carries on its back is what makes it truly lethal. Carrier Air Wing 9 is not just a collection of aircraft, it is a complete combat ecosystem. The F-35C Lightning II is the stealth spear point, the aircraft that slips forward, sees first, and hits first. The F/A-18 Echo and Foxtrot Super Hornets are the multi-role punch. They can strike, escort, intercept, and keep coming back for more. The EA-18G Growler is the invisible disruption layer, the electronic attacker that turns enemy systems into confusion. The E-2D Hawkeye is the eye in the sky, extending awareness far beyond the horizon. The CMV-22B Osprey keeps the logistical bloodstream flowing. The MH-60 Romeo and Sierra Seahawks extend the ship's reach into rescue, anti-submarine work, and multi-mission support. That is why describing Lincoln as a carrier with a lot of planes is weak writing. The stronger way to say it is this: Abraham Lincoln carries an entire airborne war package on its deck. And just as important, it carries one suited to modern war, not an outdated Cold War fantasy. The sharper way to frame capacity is not by lazily repeating old numbers like 70 or 90 aircraft. The tighter version is what your source notes suggest, a modern Nimitz configuration around 65 plus aircraft, while Lincoln's deployed strike group in early February 2026 was described as fielding more than 60 fixed-wing and rotary-wing aircraft. That sounds more credible, more current, more serious, and credibility matters, because a truly viral military script does not feel like propaganda. It feels like danger described with control. That is also why the best version of this story does not pretend Abraham Lincoln is invincible. It is powerful, yes, but it is also an enormous target, a political target, a military target, a propaganda target. A carrier that famous is too valuable not to be hunted, and too symbolic not to be claimed in disinformation. The smarter version of the script acknowledges that. It acknowledges that every viral post claiming Lincoln was crippled, sunk, or fleeing has to be treated carefully. It acknowledges that the carrier is not a lone sea monster fighting by itself. It is strongest as the beating heart of a carrier strike group. That is a crucial distinction, because the final layers of self-defense do exist, and your added material is right to emphasize them. Close-in weapon system, rolling airframe missile, evolved Sea Sparrow missile. These are not decorations. They are the last line of survival if a threat gets through cruisers, destroyers, and the outer defensive network. Even that detail changes the feel of the script. It tells the audience something important. Lincoln is not dangerous because it is magically untouchable. It is dangerous because it sits inside a full architecture of protection, sensors, escorts, aircraft, and response layers. In other words, its real strength is not cinematic invulnerability. Its real strength is integrated warfighting. And there is one more reason this ship hits so hard emotionally in a script like this. History. USS Abraham Lincoln did not become legendary in 2026. 2026 only added another chapter. The story starts in 1984 with the keel, then commissioning in 1989, then fiery vigil in 1991 when Lincoln helped lead the evacuation of nearly 45,000 people after the eruption of Mount Pinatubo, then Desert Storm, Southern Watch, Somalia, Enduring Freedom, Iraqi Freedom, then humanitarian relief after the 2004 tsunami, when a supercarrier became not just an engine of war, but an engine of rescue. Then came refueling and complex overhaul from 2013 to 2017, a rebirth that extended the ship's life and modernized its future. Then another historic turn, when it carried the first Marine Corps F-35C deployment aboard a carrier in 2022. Then the first combat strikes involving F-35Cs in 2024. That is what gives Abraham Lincoln weight. It is not just a platform, it is accumulated history in steel form: war, rescue, modernization, technology transfer, presence, survival. And now, in the Iran War of 2026, all of that history converges into a single image, a giant nuclear-powered runway at sea, already in position before the storm, already operating when the storm arrived, and still launching aircraft after the world expected it to flinch. That is the image that stays with people, not just a ship, not just a carrier. A symbol of how the United States projects power when it wants pressure without dependence, reach without permission, and persistence without pause. So if you want the hardest final line, the one that lands with the most weight, it is this: USS Abraham Lincoln did not make history in Iran in 2026 through one glorious instant. It made history through something harder. It arrived before the fire. It stayed during the fire. And in the middle of that fire, it proved why an American supercarrier is not merely a weapon, but a floating system of power that can carry an entire war across the sea.